there is one person that President Trump should pardon from federal charges forthwith. It would be incredibly controversial, but I think that it's absolutely necessary. That person is Derek Chauvin. President Trump should, in fact, pardon Derek Chauvin. He should. He should pardon him his federal charges.
Whoa. So let me ask you, Ben Shapiro. Let me ask you, Elon Musk. Are you just saying that you just don't want black people voting for you at all? There's policies taking place that a lot of people, particularly pioneers and aficionados of civil rights legislation from 1964, talking about how you got folks trying to eradicate the progress that has been made over all of these decades. Yes, they're far more educated than me on that, and I understand in their eyes, you already have no reason to be voting for folks on the right. But if they do this, if they pardon Derek Chauvin, if they let that man out of jail after murdering George Floyd, you've learned all you need to know. Don't even look at their asses no more.
So Ben Shapiro has gone on a crusade to have President Donald Trump pardon Derek Chauvin, one of the guys involved in the death of George Floyd. He's asking people to sign his petition, which he'll present to Trump somehow, who would then presumably pardon Chauvin of his federal charges relating to Floyd. Inevitably, this got a ton of pushback and has led to him being branded, you guessed it, a racist via the left. It's an interesting, hilarious, bizarre, serious, and even dangerous situation all at the same time, and one I'm vastly interested in going into. Today I'll talk about Ben's reasons for doing this, responses to his decision, and what I think of the whole thing. So soon after the Floyd arrest happened, Ben had only seen the video and didn't have much knowledge about Floyd's pre-existing conditions, or have any in-depth knowledge of the situation. He was just bound up in the emotion of it like everyone else. And since then, Ben's been vocal about his problems with the Floyd incident and the corresponding Chauvin trial.
Like everyone else in America, I first saw the tape of Derek Chauvin and George Floyd on May 25th, what appeared at the time to be 9 minutes of a police officer's knee on George Floyd's neck. Given the tape alone, I drew the same conclusions most Americans drew. I tweeted that the police officer's behavior was abhorrent. I called for his prosecution. I stated that nobody is defending the actions we all witnessed. So it's not as though I was initially a believer in Derek Chauvin's innocence. And then, over time, new evidence emerged. A lot of new evidence. And I realized I had done something absolutely wrong. I had rushed to judgment. As new information was released, the full body camera footage, the complete autopsy findings, the Minneapolis Police Department training materials, my viewpoint changed, and it changed dramatically.
And his first problem with them is how he believes they were mishandled. To start with, regarding the arrest itself, Ben thinks Chauvin absolutely fucked up, but should have been charged with manslaughter instead of murder because it wasn't fully responsible for the death of George Floyd.
The evidence demonstrates that Derek Chauvin did not, in fact, commit murder of George Floyd. George Floyd was high on. He had a significant pre-existing heart condition. George Floyd was saying he could not breathe before he was even out of the car. He was in the car saying he could not breathe. Derek Chauvin, for large segments of even the tape that was shown, had his knee on George Floyd's shoulder or back, not on his neck. The autopsy of George Floyd showed that he had no damage to his trachea, that probably George Floyd died of excited delirium. There were no accusations, even at trial, that Derek Chauvin had committed a hate crime against George Floyd or that he targeted George Floyd because of his race. Nonetheless, on the basis of extraordinarily scanty evidence.
As far as the racism murder motive claim goes, I'm not going to bother taking a stance on that. I think that's something where any conversation isn't going to change anybody's minds. People are just going to have their feet planted in the ground and that's it. But as far as Floyd's medical status goes, it's a mess. He definitely had drugs in his system like fentanyl.
Surveillance footage from inside the store shows Floyd moving around, acting erratic, interacting with store employees and customers. According to Christopher Martin, the 19-year-old cashier who testified at Chauvin's trial, Floyd appeared to be high, but was very friendly, approachable, and talkative.
He had a history of health problems, especially heart problems, also hypertension and possibly COVID, and he had an enlarged heart with narrow arteries that made it harder to breathe. He was definitely stressed out during the whole thing and said he was claustrophobic in the police car. And I don't know why you would mention that unless it was significant to some extent and worsened his stress, which it likely did.
As the body cam footage shows, Floyd told the officers repeatedly he was not resisting, but that he was claustrophobic and anxious about getting into the backseat of the police car.
Take a seat.
Okay.
Why are you having trouble walking?
Because my hands are hurt.
We will,
Please, man. Please don't do this.
take a seat.
I'm going in, Mr. Officer. I'm going in.
No, you're not.
I gotta go in.
Take a seat.
Grab a seat, man.
Man, y'all don't believe me, Mr. Officer.
Take a seat.
I'm not that kind of guy. I'm not that kind of guy, man.
Take a seat.
Dog, I'm gonna die here.
Take a
I'm
seat.
gonna die, man.
You need to take a seat right now.
And I just had COVID, man. I don't want to go back to that.
Take a seat.
I'll roll the windows
No.
down. Hey, listen.
Dang, man.
Listen.
I'm not that kind of guy.
I'll roll the windows down
Please,
and you
man.
put your legs in, all right? I'll
Y'all
put the air on.
God, look at that. Look at
You're
that.
not even listening.
Look at it. Look at it.
We can fix it, but not while you're standing out
Okay,
here.
man. God, y'all do me bad, man. Man, I don't want to try to win. I don't want to try to win. I don't want to win. I'm claustrophobic.
You ain't gonna win, bro.
I'm claustrophobic. I got anxiety. I don't want to do nothing to
I'll
them.
roll the window down.
Listen to me.
Man, I'm scared, man.
Okay.
I'm not that kind of guy.
I'll roll the windows down and
Please,
you put
man.
your legs in, all right? I'll
Y'all,
put
Then pulled in on the other side by Officer Lane. This is the first time you hear Mr. Floyd utter the words, "I can't breathe."
please.
Take a seat.
Please, man. Please. No.
Take a seat.
I can't choke. I can't breathe. Please.
The footage shows Floyd becoming increasingly distressed as the officers attempted to place him in the vehicle. He told them multiple times, "I can't breathe," well before he was on the ground. That critical fact has been largely overlooked in public discussions of the case. Floyd was claiming breathing problems while he was still standing before any significant restraint was applied, suggesting that any breathing issues may have been related to his anxiety, his medical conditions, and or the drugs in his system.
The physical stimuli from the cops, including a cop's knee on various parts of his body, made things shittier, especially on his neck, which made it even harder to breathe than it already was for him. Even if Floyd was perceived to be a threat and the maneuver was authorized, I would still think twice about putting my knee anywhere around the neck of the guy who literally said he couldn't breathe. Ben kind of downplays this bit.
What the mainstream media deliberately omits from their coverage is that Chauvin was using a departmentally approved restraint technique that was explicitly taught to Minneapolis police officers. Court documents filed in State of Minnesota versus Derek Chauvin show the Minneapolis Police Department's official training materials, which specifically instructed officers on the neck restraint as a non-deadly force option. These training materials explicitly define this technique as compressing one or both sides of a person's neck with an arm or leg without applying direct pressure to the trachea or airway, front of the neck. When you actually watch that complete unedited body cam footage, which, by the way, the legacy media rarely showed you in their entirety, what becomes clear is that for portions of the 9 minutes and 29 seconds, Chauvin's knee is on Floyd's shoulder blade or upper back.
As far as the excited delirium idea goes, there's a debate over whether it's real or not, so I probably shouldn't comment on that, and I think Ben probably shouldn't just flippantly use that. But I don't know. Not even different autopsies, one by the county medical examiner and the other independent, could fully agree on how he died. The cops, especially Derek, fucked up and was grossly incompetent, but it's not like Floyd was the picture of health. Wrong place, wrong time, wrong guy. The court case itself, Ben thinks, was an outrage, and he thinks the jury was in a sense influenced and infiltrated by outside influences, which led them not to treat this case like the standard procedural trial, like any other.
Joe Biden suggested Chauvin was guilty before the verdict.
Why is the man who killed George Floyd not in jail?
They're a good family, and they're calling for peace and tranquility, no matter what that verdict is. I'm praying the verdict is the right verdict, which is, I think it's overwhelming in my view.
I am very hopeful, and I hope that we're going to get a verdict that is say guilty, guilty, guilty. And if we don't, we cannot go away.
And not just manslaughter, right? I mean,
Oh no, not manslaughter. No. This is guilty for murder.
It became intentional and deliberate. And justice must be intentional and deliberate in this courthouse.
And so today's settlement reflects our shared commitment to advancing racial justice, our sustained push for progress, our commitment to Minneapolis, and our commitment and compassion to one another.
I understand why Eric Nelson went in there and said, I'm moving for a mistrial under these circumstances, because it's becoming incredibly evident that there are outside factors that could be impacting what happens inside the courtroom. Now, the judge said no, but he did say, and this is the saltiest I saw Cahill in this whole case, he was very upset by the comments that were happening outside of the courtroom from government officials, Maxine Waters, presumably later Joe Biden.
I wish elected officials would stop talking about this case, especially in a manner that is disrespectful to the rule of law and to the judicial branch and our function. I think if they want to give their opinions, they should do so in a respectful and in a manner that is consistent with their oath to the Constitution, to respect a co-equal branch of government.
Chauvin was arrested 4 days after Floyd's death. At first, he received a third-degree murder charge, which would have required proof of intent or premeditation. But public pressure kept increasing. The mob demanded retribution. A Change.org petition to raise the degree amassed nearly 3 million signatures online, and hashtag raise the degree trended #1 on Twitter on the day of Chauvin's arrest. Derek Chauvin had actually agreed to plead guilty to third-degree murder just 3 days after Floyd's death. Under that deal, Chauvin would have served more than 10 years in federal prison. That plea deal fell apart when then Attorney General William Barr rejected it, worried it would be perceived as too lenient by protesters across the country. Think about the implications of this. Barr rejected a deal that would have put Chauvin in prison for a decade because he was concerned about public perception and potential civil unrest, not the facts of the case or the law. Chauvin was charged with second-degree murder, which doesn't actually require intent. On March 12, 2021, right in the middle of jury selection, the Minneapolis City Council unanimously approved a $27 million settlement with George Floyd's family. This wasn't just any settlement. It was the largest pretrial civil rights settlement in American history. As former Hennepin County Chief Public Defender Mary Moriarty observed, quote, "The problem with the settlement timing is that I think $27 million sends a huge message about what the city thinks of Chauvin's behavior." The impact was so significant that Judge Cahill had to recall 7 jurors who had already been seated to determine if they had heard about the settlement and whether it would affect their ability to serve impartially. 2 jurors were ultimately dismissed after admitting they couldn't be impartial after learning of the settlement. One juror stated bluntly, "I think it'll be hard to be impartial." Another said, "That sticker price obviously shocked me."
Did it move you one direction or the other?
I would say especially that dollar amount was kind of shocking to me. That kind of sent a message that the city of Minneapolis felt that something was wrong and they wanted to make it right to the tune of that dollar amount.
Judge Cahill described the timing of the settlement announcement as unfortunate, expressing concern it could influence jurors. He stated, quote, "I wish city officials would stop talking about this case so much." As defense attorney Eric Nelson argued in court, the timing of the announcement was incredibly prejudicial. Meanwhile, juror number 52, Brandon Mitchell, later revealed to have attended a Washington, D.C. rally wearing a "Get Your Knee Off Our Necks" t-shirt, somehow made it onto the jury despite falsely claiming during selection he had never attended demonstrations about police use of force. One prospective juror's voice literally quivered as she told attorneys during jury selection she feared for her family's safety if chosen for the panel. When the judge excused her, she exhaled in relief. The media coverage of the Chauvin case was relentlessly one-sided from the beginning. Before any evidence was presented in court, before the autopsy results were even complete, legacy news outlets had already crafted their narrative. Derek Chauvin was a racist cop who deliberately murdered George Floyd. For jurors, avoiding this coverage was virtually impossible. Judge Cahill repeatedly told them not to watch the news, but as legal experts note, television news is not the only source of information in the modern age. The vast majority of people get their information from social media, online sources, and in conversations with others. The prejudicial effect of this media coverage was compounded by the fact that Judge Cahill refused to sequester the jury until deliberations began. This meant that for the entire trial, jurors were potentially exposed to media narratives, public commentary, and the intense social pressure surrounding the case.
There are so many appellate issues here that relate to what you said, whether or not this jury could be fair and impartial. Now, look, the defense had asked for relief on this front multiple times before and during the trial. First was asking for a change of venue. Now, look, take the temperature of the area. You've got George Floyd Square. You've got the National Guard. The courthouse is on lockdown. You've got businesses boarded up. And you're talking about pulling a jury pool who's going to be impacted by this. These are members of this community. Their businesses, their homes, their lives could be seriously impacted. And that really needed to be part of the analysis of that change of venue. Court said no. They said, look, it's publicity everywhere. You're not going to be anywhere in the world and not know about this case. But that's really not where the inquiry ends, right? Because there's this other aspect about whether or not jurors are going to feel that they can come back with anything but guilty on all counts. I might have asked for a mistrial at that point, but that's just me, Ben.
Let's talk, obviously, about the actual verdict. So the verdict came down incredibly fast. As soon as they said that it was coming down yesterday afternoon, I immediately said, guilty on all counts, because there was no way it was going to be anything else, obviously. You require a unanimous verdict for either acquittal or for conviction in Minnesota. There was no way they were going to acquit on all charges inside of 10 hours. That was just not going to happen. And if there had been any sort of debate, it would have been it would have gone to the judge. The judge would have told them to go back to chambers.
I wasn't even prepared, and I was on verdict watch. Thought to myself, this is crazy. I assumed that we would hear some questions from the jury. Very often, you hear the jury, they want the trial instructions, the jury instructions explained. They need a little bit more information, more context. Without one question from the jury, I was really surprised because, look, this case had a lot of complicated issues, specifically the medical testimony, the causation issue. 10 hours seemed incredibly fast, but my gut was the same as yours, Ben. When I heard that the verdict was in, I said, okay, guilty on all counts. Not what I had expected, but certainly once that speed factor with no questions, that was the result I anticipated under those circumstances.
So, Misty, frankly, I wasn't just stunned by the speed. Because it was so fast, it does, to me, raise questions about how seriously the evidence was considered in the case. Because I think that there was a fairly strong argument for manslaughter here, at least a decent to strong argument for manslaughter. I think that the case for beyond a reasonable doubt on third-degree murder is insane, frankly. I think that the elements of third-degree murder did not even fit, to the extent that originally that was not included in the charging documents, and then eventually it was replaced. And the case for second-degree murder requires a bunch of barriers to be passed. The fact that there was no questions, it's just not a clear enough case for me to feel like the evidence was properly inspected by the jury. You can't get inside the jury room. When you spend a year saying that this is the most important criminal case in modern American history, and then the jury comes back inside of 10 hours, hard for me to believe that they went in there, did an objective verification of the evidence, really went through each piece and examined it inside of 10 hours, and then came out with a conviction on all accounts.
Yeah, 10 hours is incredibly fast for that reason, Ben. And yes, the evidence was incredibly complicated. I agree with you. You know, I really thought that we might see a hung jury on all counts, and that's because of that causation aspect. I thought that was really, really murky. And remember, the standard is beyond a reasonable doubt. The prosecution has to prove every element of every charge beyond a reasonable doubt. So to me, I thought that there was a strong possibility we would see a hung jury. Public opinion should have nothing to do with a jury verdict. The jurors are supposed to be fair and unbiased in that jury room, deliberating on the evidence that they saw in the courtroom and nothing more.
You know, Misty, many prominent public officials have come out since the verdict and have openly said, if we didn't have millions of people in the street, we don't reach this verdict. Which to me is like game over as to your entire argument about bias in the criminal justice system. Your entire argument is the criminal justice system is corrupt and terrible, and that in this case they got it right. But the only reason that they got it right in this case is because we had people out in the streets. That is the definition of how the criminal justice system is supposed to not work, is that they're not supposed to care about there's millions of people in the streets for any cause. It's supposed to be about the evidence in this particular case for this individual defendant.
This, I would say, is kind of a test for how biased you are in this case. There's no way you could deny that outside influences had an effect on the jury and played a significant role in their decision. I don't think it's impossible that in some alternate universe, there was a mistrial given the settlement, which was a pretty boneheaded move to do before the jury reached a verdict. It doesn't even matter that those were separate cases, it just comes off as tone deaf for the city to do beforehand. But yeah, it probably would have been impossible to get a particularly impartial jury anywhere in the US. The final reason is because of what imprisoning Chauvin meant to Ben. The triumph of wokeism and the destruction of American race relations.
If we are talking about reversing the evils of the last several years in American life, obviously COVID and its handling was a massive evil. Destroyed the economy, set us on a path to fiscal insanity, destroyed children, led to massive health-related cover-ups, just horrifying all the way around. And President Trump has taken on a lot of those things. But when it came to BLM, the inciting event for the BLM riots that caused $2 billion in property damage in the United States and set America's race relations on their worst footing in my lifetime, was in fact the railroading of Derek Chauvin in the death of George Floyd. Derek Chauvin should, in fact, be pardoned on that. We will be covering that a lot more in coming weeks because I think it is worthwhile to remember that there is a man who is rotting in prison because the media decided in the middle of 2020 that they were going to turn a tragic law enforcement stop that ended with the death of a man who had a significant problem with drugs and pre-existing health problems into the raison d'etre of the entire 2020 election. And it led to vast chaos. It led to, again, the destruction of racial comedy in the United States, $2 billion in property damage, and a guy rotting in prison.
I'm sure you're already familiar in some sense with wokeism, the leftist fixation with race and gender politics, things like trans athletes and all that. But more interestingly, I'll focus on the race side of that, with the destruction of race relations, which Ben's talked about before and is partly attributed to Barack Obama.
One is going to be Barack Obama. So Obama goes in the F category. I think he was an awful president. I think he did horrific work, mainly with regard to his rhetoric. Between 2008 and 2012, Barack Obama morphed from a president who sort of campaigned on almost a Clintonian third way as a guy who wasn't for red states and not blue states, but the United States. And in 2012, he went just hardcore intersectionality. Anybody who opposes me is a racist. America can be divvied into various victimized groups that can be cobbled together in a new rising ascendant majority against the old America is extremely damaging. And I think that is going to be the future of American politics for quite a while. I think the Democratic Party never quite got over the Obama coalition of 2012. They've been trying to pursue it ever since, and it has broken American politics in ways large and small. So Obama goes in that bottom category. So if you're going to talk about where American politics truly went completely off the rails, the answer is Barack Obama. Barack Obama came into office as a unifier.
I'm so excited because we are going to change the world.
And then he proceeded to radically divide the American population. You can see it in the polling data. 72% of white adults thought race relations were good in 2013. So did 66% of black people. By 2015, that number was 51% of blacks and 45% of whites. Barack Obama's racial polarization was dramatic. He presided over race riots in Ferguson and Baltimore. He promoted the lie that police officers all over the United States are racist, contributing to the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, raising crime rates around the country.
These young men are incredibly angry.
Minneapolis had been a laboratory for progressive criminal justice policies. Racial tensions had been mounting for years. Following the 2014 shooting of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, and the subsequent hands up, don't shoot narrative, the Black Lives Matter movement had gained significant influence over police policy nationwide. Minneapolis was at the forefront of implementing reforms that restricted officers' ability to effectively police high crime areas. To understand the full context, we actually need to go back to the 1990s when critical race theory began to migrate from the academic fringes into mainstream discourse. Scholars like Derek Bell and Kimberly Crenshaw pushed the idea that America is fundamentally racist at its core, that our entire system is designed to oppress minorities, that concepts like colorblindness, equal opportunity, meritocracy are themselves racist constructs. This ideology, once confined to university grievance studies departments, increasingly began to influence Democratic Party politics and policy, particularly during Barack Obama's second term. Barack Obama had initially presented himself as a post-racial candidate. His 2008 A More Perfect Union speech promised a transcendence of racial division.
I chose to run for president at this moment in history because I believe deeply that we cannot solve the challenges of our time unless we solve them together, unless we perfect our union by understanding that we may have different stories, but we hold common hopes, that we may not look the same and may not have come from the same place, but we all want to move in the same direction towards a better future.
But by his second term, his administration had embraced much more racially divisive rhetoric and policy. The Department of Justice under Eric Holder and later Loretta Lynch pushed a narrative of systemic police racism, despite comprehensive studies contradicting this narrative. Harvard economist Roland Fryer, who happens to be black, conducted the most extensive empirical analysis of racial differences in police use of force and found no statistical connection linking police brutality and racism. As he stated in his findings, when it comes to the most extreme use of force, officer-involved shootings, quote, we find no racial differences in either the raw data or when contextual factors are taken into account. Fryer ultimately faced professional repercussions for publishing those findings, showing just how ideologically entrenched the narrative had become.
But in general, Ben believes that Chauvin was the ultimate unjustified casualty of a polarized racial climate that Obama fanned the flames of, escalated with BLM, and tipped over with Floyd. I can kind of see where he's coming from with that, but the letting go of Chauvin would only make the situation worse, and he even acknowledges this.
And of course, I understand that this is politically radioactive. I get it. I understand the entire American left will melt down completely if President Trump were to do this. I get that the media will lose their collective minds. And frankly, I don't care, because justice should matter more than political expediency.
Dude, idealism is the enemy of progress, and one man isn't more important than the rest of America. I understand the wanting to see his idea of justice served and Chauvin's sentence reduced, but if Ben really cares about bettering race relations, then he just has to walk away and realize America would probably be better off if Derek Chauvin's sentence stays as it is. Multiple commentators like Cenk Uygur, Patrick Bet-David, Tim Pool, Hassan Piker, Kenneth Owens, and Stephen A. Smith responded to this. I'll get to Smith last because they had a whole thing, but there was some consensus among the others. Cenk, Hamas, Piker, and Patrick Bet-David all thought Ben was grifting.
there is no reason in the world to go back and try to make Derek Chauvin a hero unless you're a goddamn racist. The real racists are against Derek Chauvin. Yeah, you black people complaining about getting murdered by the cops, you're the real racist. Don't you know that white cops are allowed to do that? Whatever, dude. Look, I get it. So this is what's happening, in case you're unaware. Ben Shapiro and DailyWire are trying to get us engaged in culture wars. That's why, why are we talking about Derek Chauvin? That happened 5 years ago. Why is he bringing it back now? Because they just introduced a $4.5 trillion tax cut for the rich. And the whole point of DailyWire is to create culture wars so you're distracted when they're about to rob you. So they're about to give $4.5 trillion to the people who funded DailyWire. So overall, as a group, right, the enormously wealthy and corporations. So they don't want you to talk about that at all. They're about to cut Medicaid by about $800 billion. They're about to not cut the Pentagon, but add to the Pentagon $100 billion. All the donors are about to get paid. Oh, by the way, also, Israel's coming for another check, and they're demanding more money to slaughter more Palestinians. So you don't want to see, Ben Shapiro doesn't want you to see any of that. So now he's going back to pick some sort of racist fight so he could rally everybody and get the whole country to hate each other again. Because it forces us to call Ben Shapiro what he is, which is an obvious, raging, racist piece of crap. So then he goes, oh my God, I was called racist. Oh, they always call everyone racist. Just because you object, just because you don't mind a black man being murdered right in front of your eyes, now you're a racist? Yeah, for that, you are a racist. So, okay, congratulations, you did it, Ben. We're back into the cultural wars. We're back at literally at each other's throats. And cross your fingers that they don't notice the $4.5 trillion tax cut that they're about to rob us of to give to the richest people in the country. That's what this is about. Otherwise, there's no reason to bring this back up.
I hate, by the way, I hate looking at a yarmulke on his head. Ben Shapiro is doing with Derek Chauvin by being the first one to demand that he get a pardon is to like clear up his SEO problem, which shows that if you Google Derek Chauvin, Ben Shapiro, up until he demanded this pardon, it would have come up to say this guy has issues.
Yeah, Matt Walsh too.
This is where, like I said, this is all like, this is again, the content of this, like we know Ben Shapiro used to have literally the opposite position on this thing, but he's got a problem, which is that the Daily Wire does not have street cred on the right, in the far right, and like the right, in the way that he needs it to. So that, you know, I mean, like it's like it's crazy. I can't believe I'm saying this, but I do believe it, and I think it's true. This is cynical even for Ben Shapiro.
Because I was going to bring that up as well as a transition away from that, but I think you're right. It is more nefarious than that. It's more, it's weirdly enough more cynical than that. Because I thought this is more so about a change in attitude amongst like Republicans, where initially they were also like, yeah, this is not us. they're like, oh, this is horrifying. This is not us. When the George Floyd murder happened, and then. Since then, by the way, also 57,000 views for this video. God damn, what a fall off. Must be studied. Asmongold on top. Holy moly.
I don't think it's you can debate the fact that it's not a good idea and it's a terrible timing.
Mm-hmm.
You can say the fact that, the Paul brothers have a documentary coming out, have a show coming out, right? It's called Paul Americans or American Pauls or something like that. American Pauls, something like that. A show's coming out. The trailer is sick, right? The way they really, it's such a great trailer that you want to watch it. And in one of the clips, Logan says, it's not about being liked. It's all about getting attention.
Mm-hmm.
That's what he says. Guess what? He gets a lot of attention. Shapiro is getting attention.
Yeah.
I don't know how Daily Wire's business is doing right now. I don't have any idea. Maybe they're killing it. Maybe they're not. Maybe, they used to not be that friendly with Fox, a little bit more friendly with Fox. Maybe they want Fox to buy Daily Wire right now. Maybe they kind of want to, hey, financially, our investors are kind of pissed off at us because they go, we got to get the returns, and you got Brett Cooper, and you got this, and you got that, and you got Candace, and you got all this stuff that's happening. But to me, they may have some other things behind closed doors that they're trying to kind of figure out things to get to do. Let me tell you how investors work. The moment EBITDA numbers drop, loans, Tom, you and I have been through this game many, many times. And you know what happens eventually when you keep going back to investors saying, we need another 200 million, we need another 100 million, we need another 50 million. Eventually they're like, maybe it's time to sell. is what we got to do. Maybe it's time to this. I don't know. I wouldn't be surprised if all of a sudden we heard news that, either DailyWire's raising another round from somebody that's coming in equity partner, whatever, or, a Fox interest reports coming out that maybe DailyWire is trying to get themselves to get a little bit closer because they would be open to the idea of Fox buying them and, what is the valuation, all this other stuff. I don't know.
Tim Pool, however, agreed with Ben, while Candace disagreed with Ben, but for different reasons than a leftist might.
USA Today. Donald Trump says he isn't considering pardoning Derek Chauvin in George Floyd's murder. Fake news. Donald Trump said, I have no idea what you're talking about. So here's the story. Ben Shapiro put out a video saying, pardon Derek Chauvin. Derek Chauvin not only was charged at the state level, but also the federal level. Ben Shapiro made the point that Trump could pardon this man who has been wrongly prosecuted in many ways. I think Derek Chauvin shouldn't be in prison at all. And I have tweeted #free Chauvin numerous times. I don't know if it makes sense right now for Trump to put this on his agenda. I mean, certainly Chauvin shouldn't be in prison, but he's going to be in state prison anyway. Even if Trump pardoned, he'll be still locked up. So I don't know why now is the right moment for this, but I'm curious what you guys think.
President Trump should, in fact, pardon Derek Chauvin. He should. He should pardon him his federal charges.
You agree?
I disagree for several reasons. The first reason is because I don't believe Derek Chauvin would want that. I was kind of surprised to see that, obviously, because I worked on an entire documentary when I was at the Daily Wire, and I had communication with Derek Chauvin's family, his friends, and to my knowledge, they did not reach out to them before doing this. And it seemed to be, sign up and we'll get this over to Trump or whatever, which is, email gathering, so to speak. And if you are going to be passionate about this issue, you should know the facts are that he's finally in a good prison. The first prison, when his mother was crying to me on the phone that he was in, was something like 9x9, and he was basically confined to solitary for 23 hours per day. And she broke down on the phone crying with me about this. That was the state prison because he's got charges. He was charged, found guilty at the state level and the federal level. So once they removed him from there and he was found guilty on the federal level, he was brought to a prison in Arizona where he was stabbed. And that was, I think it was medium. And then they moved him where he is now, which is a low-level security prison that's based in Texas, and he's much happier there. If you revoke the federal, if he pardons him on the federal, he will get transferred back to the state. And so I would just like to know what guided that. I would have appreciated if you're going to get involved in that, I think you have to speak to the family and make sure it's something that they actually want. And my imagination, having spoken to his mother, again, that was years ago, is that they would much prefer a pardon on the state level to happen, which would mean that any organization that's trying to do this because it's the moral and right thing should be getting behind someone who can make that state pardon happen, a gubernatorial race, so to speak, in Michigan.
But ultimately, do you personally feel he was wrongly convicted of murder?
Oh, absolutely. And that was the whole thesis of my entire documentary looking into the case. That was another one where, like a Harvey Weinstein, he was hung because of a social movement, and people didn't know the facts regarding that case. They didn't know anything about his fentanyl levels. They didn't know. They still thought that he cried out to his mom and said, "Mama, mama." That was actually what he called his girlfriend. And when you look at prior arrests, because he was arrested all the time in that area, he says, "I want mama, I want mama." And so, it's a sad case. Drug addiction is sad on its face. And I was happy to speak with his roommates about that and understand the struggle that he was going through. And if the media hadn't gotten involved, this should have been a case to bring Americans together because of the opioid crisis, something that black, white, no matter who you are in this country, you would understand what drugs does to families in general. And instead, they went the racial route, and the media, and particularly, I'm sorry, I said Michigan before, I meant to say Minnesota, particularly Minnesota, the attorney general withheld information from the public that would have made them realize this was never a case that was about race. It was really about, fentanyl.
I will say, though, that I don't think any of them really understood Ben's position. Shank just thought Ben was a racist and wants attention. Hamas basically thought the same, and Patrick didn't really give a shit about Ben's actual position because he probably didn't think Ben had an actual position. Tim and Candace agreed with Ben that Chauvin got screwed, but didn't understand Ben's reasoning for the pardon, as Chauvin would stay incarcerated anyway. Hamas and Patrick brought up Ben's past history on the topic, but didn't put much time into researching it. Like, these tweets show that Ben condemns police brutality and he thinks Chauvin fucked up, but as I showed earlier with clips, even back in 2022, Ben was saying that Chauvin didn't commit murder, but did fuck up and should have been charged with manslaughter. All they took from these tweets was that they thought Ben condemned Derek Chauvin, and now he doesn't. They fundamentally didn't understand his position, and didn't even try to. Finally, there's Stephen A. Smith, who had a back and forth with Shapiro, and who, in his first video, kind of implied that Ben was a racist.
So let me ask you, Ben Shapiro. Let me ask you, Elon Musk. Are you just saying that you just don't want black people voting for you at all? Better yet, are you saying you don't give a damn about black people? I mean, why wiggle around it? Why don't you just say it? Why don't you just say it? The Republicans are in a position where all you have to do is live up to what you say. Donald Trump, remember what you said in 2015? What do you have to lose? Remember that? Remember you talked about the black vote, the Hispanic vote, and how you would do for other communities outside of white nationalists and other white folks who's not a member of white nationalist parties and stuff like that. Remember that? Remember that? Yes, you may want certain things. Yes, you may want your quality of life to be a certain way. This is not a quality of life issue, Ben Shapiro. This is a quality of life issue coming to the defense of a cop whose knee was on a black man's neck for over 9 minutes. That is what you want to condone. That is what you want to let out of jail. That is what you want to fall on your sword for. Would you do it if a white Jewish person had a knee on their neck for 9.5 minutes? And it was a black cop that did it? To say something, it's the same thing along the lines where you're Ron DeSantis. By all accounts, prior to him running for the presidency, an absolutely fabulous governor in the eyes of some people. Clearly, there was a mandate in Florida when he won the midterms. There was no red wave in 2022, but there was certainly a red wave through Florida. That man won by a landslide. And what does he do? He wants to come out and give an explanation about the good benefits of slavery. Is there just a concerted effort to show that you don't give a flying shit about how black people feel? If that was a white Jewish person on the ground, cuffed, face down, whimpering and crying for their mother while telling you they're struggling, they cannot breathe, and it was a black cop on top of them with his knee on their neck for over 9 minutes, would you be calling for that person to be pardoned? I can't wait to hear your answer on that question. I really, really can't.
To which Ben responded with,
one of those people is Stephen A. Smith. Bizarrely enough, Stephen A. Smith, who is a loudmouth jackass on ESPN. Man, that's what he does. And when I say loudmouth, I mean the man does not have a volume that goes below 8 on the Spinal Tap scale. I'm not sure that there is such a thing as a normal Stephen A. Smith voice. And I say this is a longtime watcher of ESPN. Every time Stephen A. Smith comes on the TV, you got to turn down your volume significantly. Okay, so first of all, let's start with this. I don't know why he believes that it would be important, even for his stupid example, for it to be a quote-unquote white Jewish person, right, as opposed to just a Jewish person, right? His claim is that I am a tribal identitarian, and thus I would be very fine with the prosecution of a cop wrongfully if a Jew died under the knee of that cop, even if the cop was not responsible. If the fact patterns were exactly the same, but George Floyd had been named Harold Bernstein or something, and the cop was named George Floyd, was a black guy. Okay, that is intensely stupid. It's intensely stupid for a variety of reasons. Why don't we begin with the first? This would not have been a national news story if that were the case. The reason this entire story was national news is because of the race of the people involved. In fact, when black people were routinely beating up Orthodox Jews in Brooklyn, it was covered up by the New York Times and was not a national story. Okay, the reality is that this was made a national story specifically because the media had a pre-existing narrative of race in America, and this fulfilled their narrative even if the facts didn't match. 2, if in fact the facts had matched, and let's say that this was a Jewish person had been arrested for counterfeiting, for passing counterfeit bills, and then had been high on fentanyl and had a pre-existing heart condition, and then had died under the knee of a cop. Would I have said that the cop was innocent? Yes, because if the cop is innocent, the cop is innocent. That's the way this works. The race or religion of the pseudo-victim is irrelevant to the question of whether this person was in fact murdered or not. Stephen A. Smith is one of the deepest racial identitarians in our society. He does it all the time. He does it when he talks sports. It happens literally all the time. If you're talking about Nikola Jokic, the greatest center of our generation, he'll talk about how Nikola Jokic should not be included in conversations for MVP specifically because of his race. The reason Stephen A. Smith is saying this kind of stuff is because he is projecting. He is projecting a racial conversation where none exists. Here, for example, with Stephen A. Smith, just a couple of years ago, I'm a Celtics fan, so this one sprang to mind. A few years ago, Danny Ainge was the chief of basketball operations for the Boston Celtics, and Brad Stevens was elevated to fill his position. Now, it turns out Brad Stevens is a really, really good president of basketball operations. How do we know this? Well, the Celtics won an NBA championship last year, and he's been one of the most successful NBA executives in all the NBA over the course of his tenure. But Stephen A. Smith was firmly convinced the only reason that Brad Stevens had been elevated is because of his race.
It's moments like this where I get on people's nerve, particularly white America, and the NBA community specifically, because I point out it's beautiful to be a white guy. It's just beautiful. You know, you're a question mark as a coach in some people's eyes, including in Boston. But somehow, some way, you moving upstairs.
The reason that Stephen A. Smith is exercised over the George Floyd situation is specifically because of a racial narrative that is not predicated on facts. And then he's projecting that into me being some sort of racist for suggesting that the racial narrative should not predominate. This is the whole reason that Black Lives Matter was such a mistake and such a fail, because it was racializing of a question that was not in fact racial. And this is, again, it's just more evidence that what I'm saying about Chauvin is true, that the reason that Derek Chauvin is in prison right now is because he was the wrong race and George Floyd was the wrong race. And because of that, Derek Chauvin is in prison right now. Because here's the dirty little secret. It never would have been a national news story if the races had been reversed, or if both people had been white, or if both people had been black. It would not have been a national news story. And that means that the officer would have been assessed on the facts of the situation rather than on the racial narrative people like Stephen A. Smith were propagating.
Smith would go on to say that he wasn't accusing Ben of being a racist, which I'll show, but after watching his original response to Ben earlier, it's kind of hard not to come away from that believing that Smith thinks that. I'm not saying I don't believe him, I'm just saying you can't really blame Ben for thinking that. Smith would clear this up in his second response.
He says, I raised my voice. And oh, by the way, I apologize, Ben Shapiro. Let me dial down the volume so you don't have an excuse for not hearing me. Number one, I'm not accusing you of being a racist, nor am I alluding to it. I know close to nothing about you. I've never even listened to one of your shows. And that may be my loss, because anybody that's got over 7 million subscribers and has the potency of the voice that you have, you got to be doing something right. Let me tell you a little bit something about me, Ben Shapiro. If I thought you were a racist, I'd call you a racist. I wouldn't sugarcoat it. I wouldn't dance around it. I wouldn't allude to it. I'd say so. I don't know you. So it's very irresponsible, or it would be very irresponsible for me to say that. Notice how you went the liberal route, as if I don't have conservative friends. They aren't conservatives that I would support. They aren't conservatives I would have voted for. I told everybody that this election I'd have voted for anybody but Trump. Maybe not DeSantis after he brought up how there's benefits to slavery. I didn't like that. And I didn't like how folks piggybacked off of that. I just have an ultra level of sensitivity to that because there's everyday life that we're talking about here. And if you don't harbor a level of sensitivity as to how it affects communities other than your own, when you take such positions, I have a hard time being supportive of you in that regard. But I would have voted for Christie. Probably would have voted for Ramaswamy. I definitely would have voted for Nikki Haley. Back in 2016, I definitely would have voted for Kasich. Without question. I'd have voted for Marco Rubio. I'm proud to see Marco Rubio as the Secretary of State. I think he's going to do a great job. He's more than qualified. You were a supporter of Ted Cruz, if I remember correctly. I ain't like the whole Tea Party thing, but I respected it. I respected where they were coming from. Less government, intervention, free market capitalism, controlling our borders. I'm not against those messages, sir. You and I might have some things in common, Ben Shapiro, you don't even realize. Not this. So stop attaching me to the left that I criticize all the time because I'm sick of what they've done.
Secondly, I'm not sure Smith understood what Ben's position was. I think he thought that Ben thought that Chauvin was completely innocent and had nothing to do with Floyd's death, even though, as we've seen, that's not really the case.
My point, Ben Shapiro, is how much evidence do you need to see to understand that something was at the very least a contributing factor?
Because it was so fast, it does, to me, raise questions about how seriously the evidence was considered in the case. Because I think that there was a fairly strong argument for manslaughter here, at least a decent to strong argument for manslaughter.
From what I've seen, Ben hasn't called for Chauvin's state charges to be dropped, just his federal ones via a Trump pardon. He does basically believe that Chauvin should serve some time, although reduced.
Now, critics will argue, and they have argued, what's the point? Even with a federal pardon, Chauvin would still serve his state sentence. After all, A.G. Ellison is still in charge over in Minnesota, and so is Tim Walz. This is technically true, of course, but it fundamentally misunderstands the critical differences between federal and state incarceration that would make a presidential pardon extremely significant. Here's an additional, an integral detail that, aside from me, ironically, only CNN has mentioned. Derek Chauvin is currently serving concurrent sentences, 22 and a half years on state charges, 21 on federal charges. Under Minnesota's state sentencing structure, inmates typically serve only 2/3 of their sentence behind bars. The remaining 1/3 is under supervised release. That's codified in Minnesota Statute 244.101, which stipulates that for felony offenders sentenced to a fixed executed sentence, the executed sentence consists of two parts. First, a specified minimum term of imprisonment that is equal to 2/3 of the executed sentence. And second, a specified maximum supervised release term that is equal to 1/3 of the executed sentence. That means Chauvin would serve approximately 15 years of his 22 and a half year state sentence in actual confinement. But the federal system operates differently. Federal inmates earn good time credit that reduces sentences at a much lower rate than state systems. According to federal guidelines, prisoners can earn up to 54 days of good time credit per year for good behavior. On a 21-year federal sentence like Chauvin's, the maximum reduction would only be about 3.1 years, resulting in approximately 17.9 years of actual incarceration, 3 years longer than what he'd serve under Minnesota's more lenient system. Additionally, Minnesota recently enacted the Minnesota Rehabilitation and Reinvestment Act, which could potentially allow prisoners to be released after serving about half of their sentence rather than 2/3 if they demonstrate good behavior and participate in rehabilitative programs. While there are questions about Chauvin's eligibility under the specific exclusions of the MRRA, this could potentially reduce his incarceration time to 11.25 years if he qualified. So a federal pardon from President Trump wouldn't just be symbolic. It could potentially reduce Chauvin's actual incarceration by several years.
It's like that people think that Chauvin either intentionally killed Floyd or didn't contribute at all to his death, and people are projecting this false dichotomy onto Ben, even though he doesn't believe either of those. Finally, Smith had Ben on his show for an interview I didn't think was going to happen. They covered what's been touched on so far, although now Smith understands Ben's position more, but there's something to be said about how much Smith likes playing into emotions and narratives when viewing the case.
The thing that I actually objected to was the suggestion that my opinion would have changed rooted in the, say, racial or religious identity of the person who died, as opposed to the racial or religious identity of the person who was the police officer. I just don't think that that's how we ought to decide criminal justice cases in general.
In fairness to you, I can understand that in general. Damn it, in most instances, I can agree with that. But those are cases that we hear about. I'm talking about the visual impact. So let's stay right there, Ben. I am a black man, and I see this black man on the ground, face down, handcuffs behind him. Face is imprinted into the pavement. The knee of the police officer is on the back of his neck. He's literally saying he can't breathe, to one point crying for his mama. And it happens for over 9 minutes. I understand from a technical perspective, from a specific analytical perspective, forensic evidence, et cetera, fentanyl in the system, et cetera. I got all of that. My point is, and my question to you at that time was, seeing that, how could you have another opinion? Is it possible that sometimes we could be so brilliant that our intellect gets in the way of common sense? And what I would say to you as a black man in America, that there are times, and there's a preponderance of evidence throughout the years that shows that policing has been an issue as it pertains to black men, which is one of the things that we constantly bring up. So when that incident happened, I'm thinking about the officer himself, Ben Shapiro, and his intent from the standpoint. So when somebody looks at you, I look at, and this is where I wanted to go as well. I'm looking at a Ben Shapiro, and this is what I meant when I asked the question about you being, about if George Floyd was a Jewish person. I owe you an explanation for that, so I want to give it to you right now. You are known as a proud Jewish individual, incredibly supportive of the Jewish community, being amongst them, Israel, other things. And I was bringing this up because I said, if that were a Jewish person, the conclusion that you ultimately reached, would you have been patient enough to draw that conclusion, peeling from the information that was deduced on an objective level to reach the conclusion that, hey, you know what? I don't think he should have been put in jail. That's where I was going, because I know how defensive, or I shouldn't say defensive, but a defender of the Jewish community that you are. And that's what I was thinking along those lines.
If you take all of America's race relations and you sort of put it on the back of one particular fact pattern, usually the fact pattern is not capable of carrying that narrative burden.
But Ben, isn't that easy for us on the outside, looking at data, looking at analytics to draw those conclusions, as opposed to us having a personal experience or a personal investment in it? Like, for example,
once you take into account all of the facts, if your opinion doesn't change and the fact pattern is different from what you originally thought it was, then you're not doing your job as a commentator. So I can have the same gut response that you have when I first see that tape. The question is what you do when more of those facts emerge, when you do see more of that evidence emerge, when you do read the testimony and see the autopsies.
It gives some credence to Ben's thought that people had already made up their minds about how guilty Chauvin was, regardless of any evidence of other contributing factors to Floyd's death. And Ben basically said as much in a later critique of the interview.
I want to bring you some updates on our campaign for the pardon of Derek Chauvin. So yesterday I appeared on Stephen A. Smith's program, which was a lot of fun. He's a nice guy. We had a good conversation. He's definitely an interesting person, Stephen A. Smith. He's usually quite voluble. I will say that this was a pretty toned down and conciliatory conversation. There are a few particularly interesting points in the conversation. One of them is when I asked Stephen A. Smith what could change his mind in the Derek Chauvin case. What new evidence could change his mind? And he basically said the thing out loud that everybody who defends the Derek Chauvin conviction says, which is literally no information could ever change my mind ever under any circumstances, because I know what I need to know and I really don't care about all the rest of the information, as I pointed out to Stephen A. Smith there, which is that actually it was a Minneapolis Police Department trained procedure that Derek Chauvin was using, that, again, the autopsy report shows no actual damage to George Floyd's trachea, to his neck muscles. There's no bruising. He was claiming that he couldn't breathe before he was even put on the ground. He was obviously in some sort of cardiac event before he was even put on the ground. He only stops breathing for the last 50 seconds or so of the video. We talked about this all on yesterday's show in episode 3 of the case for Derek Chauvin. But the real key there from Stephen A. Smith is that it doesn't matter to him what the autopsy shows. It doesn't matter what the extraneous evidence shows. It doesn't matter even if he knew that this was a trained procedure. All that matters really is the tape. And that is not a way that we should really pursue questions of criminal justice.
But overall, I appreciate this interview, and I applaud these two for breaking barriers and discussing an issue this contentious, even all this time later. So that theory that Ben's only bringing this up for attention and therefore revenue is given a bit more credibility given that recently the co-CEO and face of DailyWire, Jeremy Boring, has stepped down. And I thought it was a decent idea given that they lost Brett Cooper and Candace Owens under him. Brett celebrated his stepping down with this Jimmy Fallon meme, and Candace didn't seem like she had a very high opinion of him when she covered it. And as far as his skills with public relations are concerned, when someone brought up the timing of the pardoning, Boring responded with, "If Ben Shapiro cured cancer, Jason Whitlock would find something in it to bitch about." What? If that was sarcasm, then it wasn't great. But if it wasn't, then I can't believe it lasted this long. And also, it recently broke that Daily Wire's cleaning house, getting rid of some employees and kids' content, which is definitely a good sign, right? Ben would give his thoughts on the matter.
The so-called God King of the Daily Wire, Jeremy Boring, who's been on this podcast many times, who is your partner in founding the Daily Wire, is no longer co-CEO, along with Caleb, who was his co-CEO for years. And now he's going to be doing something else. So there's all sorts of chatter about this online, Ben. People's tongues are wagging. People who used to work for the Daily Wire suggesting this was a terrible implosion and that Jeremy was impossible to work for, etc. What is the truth?
I mean, the truth is that Jeremy stepped down to pursue things like Pendragon, which is the single biggest, I think, entertainment offering ever put forward on the right side of the aisle, like ever by a long stretch. People are going to be
It's like a
blown
Game
away
of Thrones series that you guys are
It's unbelievable.
producing
It's
right now.
unbelievable. Yeah, I mean, it's like high fantasy, Arthurian legend, 7 episodes at very high cost. I mean, it is a major, massive project, and he has to go and he has to edit that. We have to figure out exactly how we're going to market that. We have other creative projects that Jeremy is going to work on, that Jeremy wants to work on, and that Jeremy is involved with. And frankly, the day-to-day management of a very large and growing company was not, I think, in his view, conciliant with that mission, which is for him to do more creative projects, to do more on the entertainment side. Frankly, I think for Jeremy, that's where a lot of his heart is as well.
Still, though, even if it was the case that Shapiro is mostly bringing up the Chauvin case again to get the Daily Wire popping, that doesn't mean that he's completely fake about his opinions on the case. Frankly, that idea annoys me. Just that thought that no one on earth is genuine or has real thoughts or feelings on a given subject except you and your side, especially not your enemies, is fucking annoying. Oh, and speaking of which, I wasn't even sure if I was going to bring this up because it's so random and hilarious, but Elon Musk chimed in and said that the pardoning of Chauvin was, quote, something to think about.
Among those reacting to that sound is Elon Musk, the billionaire advisor to President Trump, primarily over DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency. Remember him? Musk, who owns X, reposted the sound with the quote, something to think about, end quote. Elon Musk, what the hell do you mean there's something to think about?
It doesn't really affect anything since Musk is hated by the left anyway, but I just find it funny since in my Musk video, I said that Elon would do well to cozy up more cautiously with the right and try not to piss them off. Well, I guess he took that message straight to the fucking heart.
Elon Musk, what the hell do you mean there's something to think about?
I don't care if I offend you. I was put here to upset you. You can cry and you can scream. You can riot in the streets. You defunded the police.